brave young Iranian men and women who are willing to risk their lives on the various streets of our country, fighting for the very same freedoms that we so often take for granted here in the free world. The question remains, can Iran achieve freedom? Can we achieve that goal? Not only we will, but we must. Not only in our interest, but I think in the interest of the world. But obviously the question has always been and remains, how do we get there? There is no question that the very principles that we are aspiring to are obviously universal. I don't think the rules of the game change whether you are a citizen in Myanmar, in Caracas, or in Tehran. It remains always the same. And in that sense, I would like to first start by saying there are areas where we have to be very clear into where we stand. I, for one, am committed to a secular democratic alternative. Why do I emphasize the word secular? Because I don't believe that we can achieve democracy without a clear separation of religion from government. This has been proven time and again as a necessity and prerequisite to democratic order. It explains why in a society like America, Islam is one of the fastest growing religions, while under a so-called clerical regime in Iran, Islam is losing ground and is getting weaker and weaker by the day. It's very simple. There's freedom of religion. In Iran, there's none. These are the fundamental principles. And then it becomes a question of human rights. Do we advocate it simply as a desire and slogan, or can we codify it and put the basis of our constitution in the future on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why? Because how else could our citizenry be guaranteed of total equality? How could our citizens be guaranteed that irrespective of ethnicity, religious belief, political view, or sexual orientation, they will never, ever be segregated or mistreated? These, I think, are the elements that as a society and as citizens of that country we must strive for. In order to achieve that goal, we have to have these principles always embedded in our desires, irrespective of our ideologies, irrespective of our thinking, for the collective good of our nation, if we truly want to have a pluralistic, democratic society. Now, I also believe that it is not only sufficient to simply rely on the apparatus of states, or for that matter, a legal document like the Constitution. It takes much more to achieve and stabilize a country under these principles, in a sense that society has to also be proactive well beyond the structure of government, which is why I wanted to spend most of my time on the subject of how critical the role of civil society is in any country in order to not only institutionalize democracy, but the safeguard of democracy and human rights. As such, again, I think that a proactive society would be much more likely to expedite the process of its implementation and its safeguard. And as such, I think the topic that I wanted to use this limited time to focus on, beyond the obvious, which I think we all talk about the same issues, is what are these roles? Not only at this phase, but in the future, and also finish by pointing to some role that I believe the international community can have. When we look at today's dynamics of change in Iran, we talk about the Green Movement, for instance, we talk about a number of entities within Iran, outside government, of course, NGOs and civil society. You will realize that, in fact, the most effective elements that have proven to push the agenda of freedom in Iran forward have mostly been elements that, in fact, belong to Iranian civil society, albeit severely restrained and restricted. Nevertheless, it is as a result of their efforts that the sustenance of this movement was so far possible. And in that sense, I believe that much needs to be further invested in that, to give them more measures and more instruments to achieve their goals. As one of the panelists referred recently, he said it's not so much that they expect guidance from us, but they expect our support. I want to use a few practical examples to give you an idea of where I think, for instance, we could be effective. I've always been wondering that while the world has been limiting its focus on how to bring pressure on the Islamic regime, for instance, in the context of using economic sanctions against the current government, is this necessarily sufficient? Is it sufficient to simply have a policy of sanctions while you maintain the political status quo in mind? Using the South African example, I will tell you that the reason the sanctions were effective was because at the end, the goal was to put an end to apartheid. I've always been wondering that while the world has been limiting its focus on how to bring pressure on the Islamic regime, for instance, in the context of using economic sanctions against the current government, is this necessarily sufficient? Is it sufficient to simply have a policy of sanctions while you maintain the political status quo in mind? Using the South African example, I will tell you that the reason the sanctions were effective was because at the end, the goal was to put an end to apartheid. We cannot have an effective sanction policy without having an alternative in mind. Sanctions cannot be an end, it may be a means to that end. And then I would argue that the better leverage you have against the regime is the force of the people, much more than external economic pressures. Because while you may harm the regime, you do end up harming society as well in the long run. And that is not necessarily a good thing. Or, if people in Iran were convinced that there is an intent to put an end to this regime with the help of the international community, because it is their demand, then obviously they'd be willing to take a greater risk in tightening their belts and will be willing to assume additional economic pressure, knowing that at the end the regime may in fact collapse. There are other ways that we can have the Islamic movement at this stage. For instance, I've always been wondering, in what way can we have more solidarity between the outside world and the people inside? Let me offer this. The quickest way to force this regime to paralysis and collapse is no doubt massive labor strikes in Iran on a large scale. Now, wouldn't you think that it would be a good idea to have some kind of a monetary fund with the help of world labor unions, for instance, sanctions by a number of political parties, government, beyond government, citizens of the world, to fund such an entity as a backup and guarantee of compensation for lost wages of striking workers in Iran. And a lot of that help could be provided to Iranians by Iranian NGOs who legally can contribute and come to the assistance of the citizenry, as a means to simply give people more hope that there instrumentally is some help, as opposed to just a few resolutions in, let's say, the German parliament or the EU parliament or the American parliament. And that they're willing to fight for each other's right, not just their own personal demands. These are all positive signs that the political evolution and maturity of this nation has reached a very different level that perhaps was never achieved before. Certainly my generation never had. I look at this as a positive sign. And it would be a historical game changer to provide this generation with the full ability to succeed. Because the price otherwise will be far too heavy, not just for us Iranians, but I honestly believe for the whole world. When we are faced with the prospect of nuclearization, of proliferation, of further radicalization, when we can think of the shock that the world economy can no longer afford to have as a result of further escalation in our region, and when we ought to know and should believe that the best ingredient that could bring change to the good sense, the people of Iran themselves, who are willing and without any help so far have been committed to fight for their freedoms, it would be historically criminal not to invest on the best instrument that can bring about change, rather than contemplating military strikes on Iran or what have you. That, ladies and gentlemen, is in front of us as we speak with you right now. We don't need to create it, we don't need to invent it, we don't need to educate it. It's there, it's willing, and it's only asking, don't leave us alone, just make it easier for us and bring the cost of change down. The rest we will do. And I wanted to share that with you as well.